Thanks for coming today. This will be a nice talk. This is Charlie Frizzle, if you haven't already met him or been acquainted. Charlie is my father-in-law, so we've been acquainted for about 20 years. And so I just texted Scott, actually, and his son Scott is here today as well to hear the presentation. A quick bio as I know it, and Charlie can correct me if I'm wrong, started with your time in the Navy and a nuclear-powered submarine. And that was your introduction to nuclear power, based out of Hawaii. And incidentally, Scott was actually born in Hawaii at that time. So Carol was over there with Charlie. They've been Brunswick residents now for about 35 years or so.
71 to now, whatever that is.
Right, yeah. So you actually moved to Brunswick to take your position, to take a position at Maine Yankee, right? You know, it was interesting when Scott and I were living in Atlanta, we were the two Frizzles in the phone book of 10 million people. And here there's like 100 just in Bodenham. So it was a very interesting family to become acquainted with and to participate with. Charlie, after his retirement from Maine Yankee, has stayed very active in local community efforts. He is the chair of the town planning committee here in Brunswick. Is on the board of Midcoast Hospital, the board of the association, Independence Association, and the board of this organization for the last 6 years. He actually just went off the board in June. So thank you for your service to People Plus and for being here today. And we look forward to hearing your presentation. Someone looks like they might be coming in, but we'll just let them sneak in the back. All right, thanks.
Thank you. And welcome all of you to this 500th meeting of the Zoning Ordinance Rewrite Committee for Brunswick. Oh, wait a minute, this is Thursday, right? Again, thank you all for taking time today to listen to what I have to say about nuclear power. What I want to try to accomplish today is to talk a little bit about my own background in nuclear power, how I progressed to where I finally wound up. A short history of nuclear power as it pertains to the United States. And my views on where we are today and what the future of nuclear power might be in this country. All of that in a relatively short time frame, I hope, so that we leave plenty of time at the end for questions and answers, which is what I'm most comfortable with. So let's get on with it here. First of all, myself. I was born and brought up in New Hampshire. Attended the University of New Hampshire, studying electrical engineering from 60 to 64, not as a continually registered student throughout that 4-year period because money was very tight, and it was a matter of working one semester to get enough money to go to school for another semester, et cetera. At the very end of 1964, I found a white envelope sitting on my table when I got home that turns out that I'd won the lottery to become a soldier in Vietnam. As a student, electrical engineering and a lot of physics classes associated with that, I'd become very intrigued with nuclear power while I was in college. And so with this letter sitting on my table, I decided to see what opportunities there were in the Navy, which was very much involved in nuclear power at that time. With the recent launch of the Nautilus and other events, a lot of attention being paid to nuclear power in the Navy at that period in time. And so I visited my Navy recruiter, and he very quickly took the envelope off my hands and signed me up for 6 years in the Navy nuclear power program. Lucky for me, normally you spend about 2 years of that 6-year commitment in training, starting with your basic skills training and then moving on to nuclear power and then finally nuclear power plant operation. It's a 2-year training process. The last part of that training process involves a 6-month stint at an operating nuclear power plant, 3 of which the Navy runs in this country. I don't know how many of you know that about 5 miles north of Hartford, Connecticut, Connecticut, just north of Hartford, there is an operating nuclear power plant. Used to be operated by Combustion Engineering, and I'm not sure what the company is now that's operating it, but nonetheless, operated by Combustion Engineering at that point in time. And the Navy used that power plant to train its operators before they, train its operators before they went out to sea to operate Navy nuclear power plants. And it's a very rigorous training program. And I did well enough in that and my previous training within the Navy to qualify to stay on at that site in Connecticut for 2 more years, training other people how to operate nuclear power plants. So I had a total of 4 years on the ground operating nuclear power plants before I ever wound up on a submarine, as Stacy has indicated, stationed out of Hawaii for my last 2 years of service. And that's not a bad place to spend your last 2 years of service in the military. So that was my background in nuclear power. I got out of the Navy in 65, in 69, 70, 71. In 1971, I got out of the Navy and came back to New Hampshire, where I was from. And as it turns out, Maine Yankee was building a power plant up here in Wiscasset at that point in time. They were towards the end of construction, and I sent an application up there, and some of the people that I had trained in the Navy recognized the name and immediately invited me up, and I landed a job as an assistant engineer, worked my way through the operations branch of the company, first as an operator, and then as an operator instructor, and then I held 2 or 3 other positions until finally in 1989 I became president of Maine Yankee, a position I held until 1997 when I retired. So that's my background in nuclear power. Now let me go back a little bit and talk about the history of nuclear power in this country, just as a background to some of the things that I want to talk about later. Nuclear power in this country begins with the Atoms for Peace speech made by Eisenhower to a General Assembly of the United Nations on December 8th, 1953. This Atoms for Peace program was aimed at distributing nuclear technology and materials and know-how to many countries with less advanced research programs. A lot of people feel that Eisenhower, with some influence from Einstein, was trying to convey a spirit of comfort and cooperation to a world whose only experience with nuclear power had been Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's kind of ironic today that the very first reactors that were built in Iran and Pakistan were built under this Atoms for Peace program by American Machine and Foundry. Domestically, here in this country, that same Atoms for Peace program provided an impetus for the government to share its nuclear technology, both the Navy and otherwise, with the power-producing utilities in the country, to get them started on using nuclear power to generate electricity. One of the first plants under that Atoms for Peace program was built in Shippingsport, Pennsylvania. That was a joint project between the government and the Pennsylvania utilities to build an operating nuclear power plant as a demonstration project for the rest of the electric power generating industry. It was a very successful plant, eventually taken over by the Pennsylvania utilities and operated for many years as simply a power-producing power plant. Shortly after that, the first completely civilian plants with no national involvement, no government involvement, went online in 1959. They were the Indian Point power plants located up the Hudson River just north of New York City, and the Yankee Rowe plant in Rowe, Massachusetts. One of the first completely civilian nuclear power plants operating in this country. And a little bit of some interest anyways was how it came about. The utilities in New England all wanted to get in on this new technology. They were all heavily dependent on oil for generating electricity. They could see what oil prices were doing or were going to do in the future. They knew what effect that would have on them, and so they wanted to get on this new technology that promised to produce energy quite a bit cheaper than it could be produced with oil. But they were all very small utilities. New England doesn't have massive utilities like exist in Florida, Texas, and other parts of the country. Our utilities tend to be very, very small in terms of their service area. But they decided that jointly, working together, they could in fact sponsor a nuclear power program in New England. And that's exactly what they did. It started out with 11, eventually became 13 utilities all over New England, including Central Maine Power and Bangor Hydro and all of the other utilities in New England, came together and formed the Yankee Atomic Electric Company, which operated as a separate entity sponsored by these utilities. And the Yankee Atomic Electric Company built the Yankee Rowe plant in Rowe, Massachusetts, which went operational in 1959. Very successful plant. Operated from 1959 till sometime just after the main Yankee plant shut down. They also shut down the Yankee Rowe plant and decommissioned that. But throughout its existence, it was a model for safe, efficient nuclear power operation in this country. The model worked so well that those same electric utilities put together another corporation shortly thereafter, Connecticut Yankee Atomic Power Company, owned by all the same utilities, different percentages. Generally speaking, the utilities in the state where the plant was going to be located maintained about 50% of the ownership, and the other 50% was spread among the other utilities. So in the Connecticut Yankee case, the Connecticut utilities owned about half of that power plant and built the Connecticut Yankee plant on the Connecticut River in the southern part of the state, Haddam Neck, Connecticut. Shortly after that came the Vermont Yankee plant, and eventually in 1966, the Maine Yankee Atomic Power Company was formed. 50% owned by Bangor Hydro, Central Maine Power, and Maine Public Service, and 50% owned by the other New England utilities. The plant, as I said, the corporation was formed in '66. They first started construction in 1968. In '71, they produced their very first electricity, very late in the year, in 1971. And in 1972, it was declared commercial, and they were allowed to go to full power operation on a commercial basis. It was a 900 megawatt plant, one of the bigger ones in the country at that point in time, and cost a grand total of $231 million to build it. If you were to build that same power plant today, you'd be probably talking somewhere between $1 and $2 billion. Throughout the 70s and 80s, the whole country was under a relatively rapid growth in that era. And the utilities were very, very stressed to keep up the pace, to build power plants fast enough to keep up with the economic growth in this country. All kinds of power plants, whether you're talking coal, oil, or nuclear. Lots of electric power plants were built in that double decade, 70s and 80s, when we were experiencing such huge growth in the country. With the 15 or 20 plants that were operating at the time Maine Yankee went in operation, from there up until 1990, through those 2 decades, another 100 or so plants were put in operation. A lot of nuclear power plants, not just electric plants, nuclear power plants. About 100 of them were put in operation during that 20-year time span. By the early 1990s, the economic growth bubble burst, or sagged at least, and all of a sudden the utilities were caught with more power plants either online or in a final state of production, construction I mean, that we were overbuilt. The utilities were, by and large, overbuilt at that point in time. And we saw a big slowdown in new orders for power plants, including nuclear. All of a sudden, nobody was ordering new nuclear power plants. They had to work off the excess capacity that they already had in hand. That, along with an awful lot of political pressure, especially with respect to nuclear power plants. There has always been an extraordinarily active anti-nuclear program in this country that simply does not want nuclear power to exist, period, in any form, and has actively proposed or opposed power plants being built in this country. And as a matter of fact, right here in Maine, we experienced 3 separate referendums to shut the Maine Yankee plant down. We defeated all 3 of them, but nonetheless, it was a tough political battle in each case to win those referendums and avoid having to fight to save our life. With the more or less rapid economic growth that began again early in this century, and other than through the recession, but just prior to the recession and now picking up again, there are quite a few utilities now that again are having to build new power plants. And several of them, especially in the South and in the Midwest and West, Texas, Florida, those states, are ordering new nuclear power plants right now. There are about 20 new power plants on order. I think 2 of them have gone to the point where they've been given the go-ahead to construct, and the others are in the process of being reviewed. So there is a slight renewal, if you will, in interest in nuclear power in this country at this time. One of my reasons for reviewing the history of nuclear power in this country is that many people view this as a new technology and fail to recognize that it's a technology that's been producing electricity in this country for well over 50 years now. It's a very settled technology. I remember in the period, early period especially when Maine Yankee was operating, there was hardly a day gone by that you couldn't open the newspaper and find some sort of a scare story or horror story or whatever with regard to nuclear power, whether it be a protest or a problem or whatever. There was a nuclear power story almost every day and certainly weekly. When's the last time you picked up a newspaper lately and saw anything detrimental with respect to nuclear power in this country at least? It's been quite a long time now. You hardly ever see it in the papers anymore. We've gained an awful lot of experience operating these plants and learning how to operate them properly and safely, such that they operate almost under the radar anymore. There are 104 nuclear power plants operating currently in the United States. People really don't recognize that. 104 power plants operating day in, day out, and you never even hear about it anymore. People don't even realize there are that many of them, but there are. As I've talked about, many utilities now are poised to add new capacity, and they're placing orders for at least a few new nuclear power plants. How many ultimately will be built will depend on several factors. Obviously, the economy. Nuclear power plants are very expensive to build. A lot of upfront money necessary to build a nuclear power plant, no doubt about it. Now, if you take a look at the amount of power that they can generate over the life of the plant, it's a bargain. But it's still very tough to come up with $2 billion to build the plant in the first place. When you consider all of the risks, political and otherwise, associated with licensing that plant and finally getting permission to operate it, it's still a very tedious process in this country. And the risks of the government at some point near the very end of your construction telling you, no, you can't go ahead, are still pretty high. But nonetheless, despite all of that, many of the utilities, and especially those with a long track record of experience on how to do it right, are going ahead with orders for new nuclear power plants. Politics will play a role, as it always has in nuclear power. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And the issue that probably is in most need of being settled before we talk about a lot of new nuclear power plants in this country is the issue of nuclear waste disposal. Going back a bit again, there's an important precept underlying development in this country going back to the Atomic Energy Act of 1947. At that point in time, most of the waste being generated in nuclear power programs was being generated by the military, obviously. And the government considered that the proper disposal of this waste was too important to ever turn it over to a civilian entity. That it was the government's responsibility to take care of nuclear waste, high-level nuclear waste. That concept remains in effect. It underlies the whole program in this country today. The government has said it is our responsibility to take care of the high-level nuclear waste. During the first 40 years following that act in 1947, the government did absolutely nothing to address that responsibility. Nothing happened. All of the nuclear waste that was generated over those 40 years was stored at the power plant or the military facility or whatever where it was generated. Stored safely, but nonetheless stored, waiting for the government to fulfill its responsibility. Finally, in 1982, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act was created, which both established a timetable and a process for establishing a permanent underground repository for high-level nuclear waste by the mid-1990s. The Department of Energy was chosen to site, construct, and operate a facility. The Environmental Protection Agency would set the public health and safety standards, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission would regulate the construction and operation of the facility. The act required the government to take ownership of all high-level waste at the reactor site, transport it to whatever repository was finally chosen, and thereafter be responsible for care of that waste, proper disposal of that waste. In turn, the people that generated the waste were required to cover the costs of the program. And as far as the electric power industry was concerned, that payment, if you will, was in the form of a 1/10 of 1 cent per kilowatt hour that each plant generated. 1/10 of 1 cent doesn't sound like an awful lot of money, but when you take a look at the amount of power, for instance, that the Maine Yankee plant generated in 1 year, that amounted to anywhere from $5 to $7 million a year going to the government to pay for the ultimate disposal of the waste. And there are lots more power plants, 104 of them now, and most of them are bigger than the Maine Yankee plant. So they're talking about sizable chunks of money going into the government every year to cover the costs of the waste disposal program. Once a search for a site got started under that program, the 82 program, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, the Department of Energy made a political mess out of going all over the country looking for a proper site, getting everybody all scared that it was going to wind up in their backyard and so forth. And finally, Congress decided to put an end to that in 1987. They took a look at all of the research and all of the information that had been gathered at that point and selected Yucca Mountain, Nevada, as the ultimate site where that waste would be disposed. And also in that same amendment in 1987, they established the year 1998 as the year that the government would finally take possession of the waste and begin moving it to that Yucca Mountain facility. When 1998 came, and the Department of Energy was nowhere near opening up the Yucca Mountain facility, a group of, a lot of the utilities that were storing the waste on site, and especially those that owned decommissioned power plants, like Maine Yankee. By 1998, the Maine Yankee plant had been decommissioned. We no longer had any income source to pay for caring for that waste on site. The Department of Energy was supposed to take it away from us in 1998. They didn't. So we joined, or Maine Yankee joined, that suit against the federal government. And as you may have heard, in the recent past 3 or 4 years, those utilities finally won that suit. And the government has had to pay them back for storing the waste on their own sites. Pay them back the money that they had put in originally while they were operating their plants. And Maine Yankee has received payments from that suit. The problem is they only pay you for what has been done in the past. They don't do anything for going forward. So you have to wait about 2 or 3 years until you're tired of spending money to care for your own waste, sue the government again, go through the whole legal process, and finally win again. They've done that twice now, and they're in the third cycle. Just the way politics works these days. In 2002, the Department of Energy recommended the Yucca Mountain site to the President after going through all the studying of the site that was necessary. The President approved the site. In April of 2002, Nevada vetoed that, which they had the right to do under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. Shortly after that July 2002 date, the Congress overrode Nevada's veto, which they have the right to do. So the process went forward then. In late 2002, the Department of Energy went to work studying the site, doing all the scientific research that was necessary to prove that that was going to be a safe site to store the waste. They completed all of that work in 2007, early 2008. All of that work was completed. They had a final safety analysis report, which any nuclear facility has to produce before they go operational. They generally run 10 or 15 volumes that wide, covering all the scientific research that you've done to prove that the operation is going to be safe. The Department of Energy submitted that safety analysis report to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And then in 2009, one of the first budget proposals, and one of the only budget proposals that President Obama has ever submitted to Congress, stopped all work on the nuclear waste program. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission was directed not to continue their review of that safety analysis report, the final step in the process. Review the final safety analysis report. If everything is the way it should be, the site can go into operation. They were ordered to stop that review in 2009, and that's where the waste disposal program sits today. And I think as long as Harry Reid is the majority leader in the Senate, he's from Nevada, by the way, that's probably the way the things are going to be. Just saying. To date, something in the range of $34 billion has been collected from the utilities to construct that site in Yucca Mountain, Nevada. $10 billion has been spent constructing it and doing all of the licensing work necessary to put it in operation. And it sits in this limbo that I just talked about. Where has the rest of the money gone? Where all dollars go once they flow to Washington, wherever they want to spend them. So where are we today? I've talked about a possible nuclear power renaissance with the utilities that are starting to order new power plants now. They're carrying around this burden of having to store their own waste as long as that issue remains in limbo. So they're going despite that burden. There has been a recent acceptance of nuclear power by some of the mainstream environmental groups. Sierra Club, Audubon, others have recognized that when you take a look at the big picture of how we generate power in this country, what kinds of waste we produce, et cetera, nuclear power comes out a winner. And it comes out a winner economically. And they've recognized that and are beginning to change their opposition. That doesn't include all environmental groups, but certainly some of the leaders in the environmental community. I think whether or not utilities will go forward with further orders of nuclear power plants is going to depend an awful lot on how these first few that are in the pipeline right now work out and what happens with respect to the whole nuclear waste program. That's the big millstone that they're dragging around. As far as the future is concerned, if you take a look at what the utilities refer to as base load needs. Base load is that electricity that has to be produced 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It's a minimum amount of electricity that we have to produce because we're using that much electricity on a 24-hour-a-day basis. There is no other forms of power generation that can satisfy that 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week, et cetera, responsibility other than conventional fossil fuel plants, whether they be coal, oil, or gas, and nuclear power. The other energy sources that are getting a lot of consideration these days, wind, solar, et cetera, don't operate on a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week basis. They're there when the sun shines, or they're there when the wind blows, but our economy can't stand not generating that base load electricity. So as the base load needs continue to grow, we're going to have to make decisions as to whether we continue with fossil plants. And obviously, nowadays, gas plants, natural gas power plants are very popular. They're about the only fossil-fired plants that are being built new from scratch these days. And they're much more gentle to the environment than a coal-fired power plant, for instance. But they still produce carbon dioxide at the rate of millions of tons per year that gets disposed of in our atmosphere. Nuclear power plants, on the other hand, all of the waste that Maine Yankee generated over a 30-year period is sitting up there on the ground in Wiscasset in 61 large cement casks sitting on the ground. 61 casks, 30 years, almost 30 years of operation. If that had been a coal-fired power plant, the entire 200-acre site would be buried in about 3 feet of ash, if it could all have been contained on the site. Again, not to mention the CO2 in the millions of tons that would have gone up the smokestack. So we have to take a look at waste, I think, from a big picture standpoint. Nuclear power plants generate a very dangerous form of waste, high-level nuclear waste, needs to be cared for properly, but we know how to do it, and it's produced in very small quantities. We could reduce the 61 casks to 6 casks if we were to embrace the technology in this country that's now being used in France, the Soviet Union, and Japan. And we can talk about that more if anybody is interested in that. So there are answers, but some of the questions are kind of difficult. I'll leave it at there. We've got 25 minutes or so till 2 o'clock, and longer. I can stay a while longer if you like. And I'll be more than happy to address whatever questions you might have with respect to nuclear power or Maine Yankee or whatever. Yes, sir.
How long does the high-level waste rate?
Thousands of years. Let me put a caveat on that. If you were to take that, what we call high-level waste in this country is a spent fuel assembly. If you were to reprocess that spent fuel assembly, you could reduce the volume of that high-level waste by 90%. 90% of that spent fuel assembly is uranium. It can go back into a new fuel assembly and back to a power plant to be burned again. 90% of what we call waste. And it's not like this is some new leading-edge secret technology. We were reprocessing spent fuel in upstate New York during the 50s and into the 60s as part of the development of the nuclear power program in this country.
Is that the technology that's being used in France?
Yes, yes. They reprocessed their spent fuel. Jimmy Carter, in 1979, put a stop to all reprocessing, spent fuel reprocessing in this country. One of the byproducts of spent fuel reprocessing is plutonium. That plutonium goes right back into the fuel that goes into another power plant and gets burned again. But it is plutonium. I don't know how you would separate that plutonium from the other nuclides that come out of the spent fuel reprocessing process, but nonetheless, because plutonium is one of the byproducts, he took a moral ground that we weren't going to generate any plutonium in our civilian industry. And so he put a moratorium on all spent fuel reprocessing. There was a plant being constructed in South Carolina, about 95% finished, big plant. Other than, unlike the small one was operating in New York, this was a big commercial scale, would have satisfied a good part of the need of the industry, and stopped. 95% done, 95% paid for, and stopped. It's there today, as far as I know. Yes.
That was a moral decision on the part of Carter. Could that not be revisited?
Oh, it certainly could. You've got to find the president with the political gumption to do it, that's all. It's controversial. Yes, sir.
If, it sounds as if the stalemate there is a purely political, there are no technical issues.
There are no technical safety issues that I'm aware of, certainly.
If that political statement were overcome, it sounds as if from what you're saying that on-site disposal and containment would probably, in the long run or short run too, make more sense than trying to find a single repository and find a place that would accept that politically.
Personally, I feel it is much, much safer to put all of the nuclear waste into a single repository than it is to have 104 nuclear repositories scattered around the country, operated by 50 or 60 different utilities, overseen by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to be sure, but it's scattered all over the place. That, to me, is not the safe way to take care of the waste. The safe way to take care of that waste is to put it in one place where it's being properly disposed of.
And if there were that single place, would that eliminate the case for the use of the new technology on site?
No, it doesn't eliminate it.
That it would combine the-
You could combine the two. You could build a reprocessing facility right there at the disposal site and wind up having to put into your repository only 10% of what you took in instead of the whole 100%. Yes?
Charlie, I can't remember now, can you remind me about the genesis of the decommissioning of well, because we were main yanking with the others, was it strictly because of the excess capacity? Or was there other, what was the genesis? of the
Excess
decommissioning?
capacity was a factor, but Maine Yankee was generating electricity so cheaply that it would have been the last power plant that you'd want to shut down because of how cheaply it was generating electricity. It had to do with the fact that it was an older plant. Regulations keep evolving. New safety regulations were in place, and it was going to cost Maine Yankee something in the vicinity of $70 million to upgrade the plant to meet the new safety standards. With all the opposition, political opposition to nuclear in the state, the utilities who have to pay attention to politics because they depend on politicians to set their rates, how much they can charge. So they're very politically sensitive. So paying attention to the politics, looking at a $70 million expenditure, they decided to shut the plant down.
As just a follow-up to that, may I just mention that I remember when all this was happening, and in the more current environment, we do hear a lot, we hear it in Maine a lot, but we also hear it in other parts of the country, which is about the high cost of power generation, forgetting about environmental costs and all those, the actual dollar and cent cost, and the incentives and disincentives to other forms of growth in your economy, whether they be business or whatever, and in people's pocketbooks and what they pay for electricity, and we know Maine is one of the highest in the country. Does that factor into reconsideration of projects such as this today? Maybe here or not here, but just in general?
It certainly factors into it. You can't deny the economics, but it's a two-edged sword as far as nuclear power is concerned. Once you get your plant built and operating, you can generate power for about 2 cents a kilowatt hour, roughly equivalent to what it costs to run a coal-fired power plant. And they're neck and neck right now. But in order to get to the point where you can generate electricity at 2 cents a kilowatt hour, you got to spend $1.5 billion to $2 billion to build a new plant.
For a zero carbon
Tough decision.
option?
Excuse me?
For almost a zero carbon option?
A purely zero carbon option. A nuclear power plant doesn't put any carbon into the atmosphere whatsoever. Yeah. There are pluses and minuses, And some of those are hard to reconcile when you sit down there and start looking at the books and kind of figuring out how you're going to raise $1.5 billion or $2 billion, whatever it takes.
What's the cost of building a comparable coal?
Coal-fired power plants are much cheaper. I don't have current cost estimates, but I'd guess they're probably in the range of, I don't know, half a billion
Oh, so
to build a big
considerably
plant.
less.
Considerably, much, much less. Yeah. Yes, sir.
3 Mile Island, four-part question.
4 parts, okay.
Is that a design flaw, a human flaw? What has been done so it doesn't happen again? And what's the status of that plan?
Okay. First two are yes. It was both a design flaw and a human flaw. The design of the plant, this was a unique plant built by Babcock and Wilcox. They only built a few power plants in this country. They had a rather unique design as far as their steam generators were concerned that allowed them to superheat the steam a little bit, made them a little more efficient than other power plants, so they were attractive from that standpoint. But one of the valves near the top of the plant, safety valve, when it got stuck, could indicate that it was closed, like it was supposed to be, when in fact it was stuck open. So that indication flaw, if you will, confused the operators. But then you can fault the operators for not taking the most conservative action, which kind of a bottom line tenet in the nuclear industry is keep the core covered. Put water in no matter what your doubts are about whether you're doing the right thing. Put water in. Well, they got a false indication that the valve was closed, didn't think they needed to put water in, they shut off their safety systems. And eventually boiled the water away from the reactor, melted about 50% of the core before they finally realized what they had done wrong and started putting water in again. The plant still sits there today. Its sister plant is operating, but the affected plant sits there today. Someday, maybe, they will open it back up again after the radiation levels decay to the point where they can work on it again. They may go in and try to recover, remove the slag, if you will, the melted slag from the internal of the reactor vessel, and either decommission it. I doubt they'll try to reuse it. It would take an enormous amount of safety review to prove that that vessel was still safe. So my guess is they would probably scrap it at that point. But right now, it sits there, sealed up. Did I get all 4 parts answered?
I think so. Thank you.
In the back.
What percentage of Maine's power did Yankee produce?
At the point when it was operating, generating 900 megawatts, if the main utilities had owned the entire plant, we could have satisfied over half of the state's needs, one plant. With the half that they owned, we satisfied about a quarter of the state's needs. Yes, sir.
Are we getting some of our power from Canada, from Manitowoc?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much comes through right now. It's always there in the event that we have a shortage down here. We can import power from Canada. And I would imagine that some of the utilities have longer-term contracts than that, although I haven't kept up with that too much. But a lot of that comes from Point Lepreau, which is a Canadian nuclear power plant, a set of Canadian nuclear power plants. I think there's 3 of them up there now that generate electricity for the Canadian utilities.
Does New York City get any of their power from Canada?
I guess, I don't know. I really don't know where New York City's getting all its power from now. The Indian Point plants, the newer ones, are still operating, so they're still getting some of their power from nuclear power. The 104 plants that operate in this country are supplying about 20% of our electricity needs. Where New York sits in there, are they less than 20 or more than 20? I don't know. If you look on your nuclear power, on your CMP bill, on the back, to see where your power is coming from, you'll find that about 20% of your power right here in Brunswick is coming from nuclear power. Not from Maine anymore, but coming from nuclear power operating outside of Maine. the Seabrook plant in New Hampshire, for instance. It's a very large plant, still operating. Whoever?
So Charlie, what would be a normal life cycle for a nuclear plant, independent of political considerations for
Yeah,
customers?
The design life is 40 years. That was established only because they didn't want to press their science, which told them how long things should last. They didn't want to press that too far, so they set it at 40 years to be conservative. But they also made a provision in the law that after 40 years, you do a review of your plant, tests, whatever you need to do, and assuming everything is still fine, you can license it for another 20 years. And 20 years after that, and so forth, until finally you find something that, nope, this has worn to the point where it's not worth fixing anymore, and we'll have to decommission the plant. Yes?
And you were talking about the 20% of your energy, your electric bill from the nuclear,
Mhm.
not Maine Yankee, because we don't have Maine Yankee, but did the Maine Yankee Corp retain membership in the regional cooperative, essentially, or corporation, to go back into the pile for the percentage fees? Like, in other words, the 20% here, is some of that because we are still, somebody in our state is still participating in this, or is this just because it all goes to a master grid and we just buy what we bought?
As far as I know, what is now Iberdrola, used to be CMP, still owns a percentage of the remaining operating power plants at Millstone, Connecticut. Vermont Yankee, although Vermont Yankee's due to shut down and decommission here very soon, and Seabrook. So that 20% is coming.
I'm wondering,
In-
what I was wondering, getting at, in relation to that, the part that just doesn't come off the mothership, the generic mothership, does that affect the price we pay for it, for our share, because of this ownership relationship?
Yeah, it serves to reduce the cost of your standard offer electricity, because it's still one of the cheapest sources of power in the country. Yes?
Canada, are they more hospitable to nuclear power than we are, or is it about the same, do they have the same political considerations?
I'd have to rate them a little bit more hospitable, just based on what I've seen them accomplish with their nuclear reactors in Newfoundland and around. But at the same time, they enjoy an enormous amount of hydropower. And that constitutes a very significant portion of their electric power generation. And I would guess that now that fairly abundant fossil fuels, oil and gas, are being exploited in Canada, they're probably using some of that too.
Would you consider hydropower as one baseline fuel, or is that too unpredictable?
No, hydropower can be a baseline if it is a, how do you say this? If it's a facility that involves a large reservoir of some kind. No, not the Bay of Fundy. The whole Moosehead Lake region backs up the hydropower that exists in Moscow, Maine, and allows that to operate. If they wanted to operate it this way, they could operate it on a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week basis at somewhat lower level than they typically do. What they generally treat hydropower is an intermediate form of fluctuating, because it's very quick to open up the valve and let more water through, or close the valve and less water through. It's a very fast responding kind of power availability, and that's mostly what it's used for. Then you've got hydropower like the one we have right here in Brunswick, between Brunswick and Topsom, which is run of the river. We take whatever the river gives us in terms of power from that plant, because there's no backup. We can't flood Lewiston to create a lake here behind our dam.
Who says?
Well, depends on how you feel about Lewiston, I guess. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
I have more of a grid question, which I don't really understand. I'm under the impression that you have to, there's no excess electricity in the grid.
Right.
So as demand rises, you have to immediately produce it. Is that,
That's exactly right. The grid has no storage capacity whatsoever.
so what's the leeway in there? What happens if a huge source just turns something on? How does a power company?
Then a huge power plant somewhere has to respond to that. The grid, when it sees a huge power source like that come on, the grid slows down. If you had a meter that could measure cycles per second, 60 cycles per second, you'd see it would drop to 59.9 or 59.8. Immediately that triggers a power plant somewhere, depending on the type, whether it's a hydro plant. Gas-fired plants are very quick to respond. Those plants would come up a little bit, make up the difference, and you're back to stability again. But it has to be a very, very fast responding circumstance because there is.
Brownouts are in the summertime?
Well, in the summertime, when there's an awful lot of load, one of the ways that the utilities save electricity is by slowing you down. They'll drop you down to 59, well, not 59 cycles, but 59 and a half or whatever, and don't bother to raise the amount that's being generated. Your appliances suddenly become a lot less efficient, and you're using less electricity. Yes,
Are those fluctuations automatic, or are they?
they're automatic, yep, they're automatic. Yes,
Who does that,
go ahead.
who does that adjustment here? Like, I was in Lewiston this morning, and the central part of the city lost power.
Mhm.
How does that, I mean, you've got X number of megawatts coming in, and all of a sudden,
In that case,
part of it is not.
in that case, the same sensors that are looking at cycles per second would see that it's gone up to 60.1, and a power plant somewhere would suddenly drop the amount of power that it's producing.
Now, would that be somebody from,
Could be anybody in New England. The central control for all of this is in Massachusetts, for all of the New England area. That all happens in Massachusetts, and it affects every power plant in New England.
So when a tree falls in Maine,
When a tree falls in Maine, a butterfly lifts the power up in Vermont or somewhere. Yes.
Charlie, this might be a closing of the loop of one thing, but that speaks to your zero-sum game on the grid, versus Marty's question, which is because of growth, just general kinds of growth, everywhere, not just here, but everywhere, economic growth, technological growth. I'm assuming that there is that creative tension between the push to all of us to consume less electricity if we can, buy more efficient devices,
Sure.
buy an efficient washing machine. You know, basically, if you get too efficient and you don't use enough, of course, the power companies suffer because they're not selling enough, and the grid also has to equalize itself. But I'm assuming there's some creative tension between the desire and need to conserve and be more efficient and use less in order to allow this grid to equalize itself without needing to build as many plants.
Sure, and we've seen that over the last, 15 or 20 years. If you forget about the recession and just plot the 15 or 20 years, there's been a tremendous amount of economic growth. But the need for electricity has grown at a much slower rate because of the fact that people are becoming more conservation oriented. We're willing to buy or spend a lot of money for LED light bulbs and things like that that use a lot less electricity. And so the need for base power and fluctuating power, for that matter, has grown at much slower rate than it would have in previous similar economic growth periods.
So what do you see as the future of nuclear power in the United States? You know, you talk about the plants that are currently being built slowly, the demand you see because of efficiencies, that the demand will continue to be somewhat stable, so therefore the future of nuclear, independent of the politics, or maybe you can't make it independent of politics. You know, where do you see the future?
Well, first of all, I don't see the demand ever being completely stable. It's going to continue to grow. Our population is growing. Hopefully, our economy continues to grow. And all of those put a demand for electricity out there. We can trim that quite a bit, but we can't eliminate it. So the need for power will grow, but at a much slower rate than we had to try to keep up with in the 70s and 80s. Much slower rate. So people can make much more informed decisions because they got a lot more time to think about it. Where nuclear power will fit in there, you'll have to tell me what's going to happen to the politics, which is going to play a huge role, as it always has, and whatever other factors are involved. But nuclear power especially is a slave to the politics surrounding general fear of things nuclear in the first place, and the government's inaction with respect to waste disposal. Two big ifs as far as nuclear power is concerned. I don't know how those are going to be resolved. I'd like to think positively about that stuff, but I've been thinking positively about it for about 40 years now, and continue to be disappointed.
Charlie, have you ever considered writing a book?
No, ma'am. I am not a writer. If you want to record this and write it down for me, that's your business.
Bernie's prepared to go home and transcribe it.
Yes, sir.
I feel a little embarrassed about asking this question, but where does the fuel come from that powers the plant?
The nuclear power plant? When I left the industry, most of the uranium mines in the United States were not operating simply because they were not as economical as uranium mines in Canada and New Zealand and Australia, which is where virtually all of the fuel for Maine Yankee was coming from at that point in time. And the way the industry works is Maine Yankee would contract with mining firms in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, to send the raw ore to a processing plant, and then we'd pay the price in the processing plant to have it turned into uranium oxide, pay the Department of Energy to have it enriched, and finally be put into fuel assemblies and come to Maine Yankee.
All right. Any last?
Yes?
Would you like to say something about Fukushima?
Yeah, just a few words. The whole Fukushima accident was a result of the Japanese not being sensitive enough to what a giant tsunami could do to their oceanfront power plants. They were prepared for tsunamis in the range of about 10 to 12 feet. They were overwhelmed by a 30-foot tsunami that flooded their entire site. It killed the grid. The wires that were connected to the plants were knocked down, dead. So they couldn't bring in any power to operate their equipment. And their diesel generators were flooded. The diesel generators could have handled a 10-foot surge, but they were flooded by a 30-foot surge. So the diesel generators became useless. They had no way to power the pumps necessary to keep the cores cool, and so they melted 3 cores, ultimately. That's it in a nutshell. Some of the releases from that accident contaminated farmland in the area, which will have to be left idle for quite a number of years. But other than that, no one was killed, no one was injured, but they've got 3 destroyed power plants and a lot of contaminated farmland.
Charlie, is the conclusion from that the design standard needs to be rethought in a location like that, or that the location's bad?
Location's fine. As a matter of fact, the Japanese regulatory bodies had recommended that the utilities beef up their tsunami defenses, if you will, beef up their protection against tsunamis. The regulatory system in Japan is much different than it is today. Japanese, as they have always done in their industry, operate on an honor system, a trust system. And if everyone is honorable and trustworthy, they will listen to the regulator and do what's right. But often they're very slow to do that because they're not required to by any law, contrary to what we do in this country. And so they were slow in responding to that advice from their regulator, and Fukushima paid the price, along with the whole rest of Japan, obviously. In this country, we have, for better or worse, a very strong regulatory system. If the regulatory agency says that plant's not safe, shut it down, you shut it down. You don't ask questions. You don't say, well, we'll think about it. You shut it down or pay the penalty of law. And that regulatory system has its abuses. They can force regulations on the industry that perhaps are unnecessary, very costly, but nonetheless, it has worked pretty well to produce a very safe industry in this country. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.